Okay, guys, so I'm dealing basically now with chapters 3 and 4, maybe a little bit of chapter 2, but no worries here. The topic of my audio summary today is something I call the old colonial system, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But what I first will do is I will summarize specifically just chapter 3, so you know kind of in general what's going on. Then I'll let you know when I'm transitioning into my thematic approach. Okay, so just chapter 3 first. England discovers its colonies. And so you're dealing here at the beginning of the 17th century where England, it's a weak power with no American colonies, but by 1700, it's a global giant with 20 colonies in North America and the West Indies, important overseas trade routes. She's rich, she's awesome. Now, this change happened during a century of civil wars, political and religious upheaval, long struggles between various kings, parliaments over power. And the result was a distinctive form of constitutionalism resting on parliamentary supremacy and responsible government. Representative government was taken for granted in England and its colonies. It was just assumed, guys, that English colonies would elect an assembly that voted on all taxes and consented to all local laws. Parliament claimed full power over the colonies, but in practice it seldom regulated anything except overseas trade. So to the English government, this was a convenience. But in America, it came to take on overtones of actual rights, and I'll speak to that later. Now, England's upheavals rocked the emerging empire politically and economically. The disruption of trade cut off some of the settlements from their regular trade sources. Increasingly, the Dutch were active in trade with the English colonies. This fact contradicted the developing theory of mercantilism. Under this system, colonial commerce was an important source of a country's wealth. Areas that produced valuable commodities unavailable at home were considered essential, and colonial expansion in those areas was encouraged. Parliament passed a series of navigation acts to regulate overseas trade, on the assumption that colonies existed only to enrich the mother country. So for most of the 17th century, the Spanish, French, and English empires remained isolated from one another and developed in different ways. Spain concentrated zealously on missionary pursuits among the Native Americans in North America, and after a period of exploring and some missionary activity, the French engaged in the fur trade in the Great Lakes, the great legends of the Coureurs de Bois, the runners of the wood. The English emphasized settlement and expansion, and hence greatly increased the number of inhabitants in their colonies. The population of British North America doubled every 25 years, profoundly affecting provincial American life. Life in the colonies was also affected by the wars among European countries that subsequently spread to their overseas colonies. Okay? Now, that's your summary of Chapter 3. Now, let me tell you how I think all this fits into the pattern of where we're going. I mean, obviously, guys, you know how this is working. We're building up soon here to the American Revolution. And we're really getting to a phase here where it really starts laying the foundation of why it happened the way it did. Okay? So I'm starting to work in that mindset of how did we get to the American Revolution and why did it happen? And that's why I called this the old colonial system, this 100 years before the American Revolution. Because I think the origins of the Revolution were planted in 1607 with Jamestown, with the very beginnings of colonization. This was the first step towards revolution. They didn't know it. Colonization was a natural step towards revolution, in my opinion. The revolution was generation in makings, yes, but the idea of independence was growing from the moment these early colonists crossed the ocean. The experiences these early colonists experienced liberated their minds. They felt free from the many old world conventions they had lived under, and they began to believe these old world conventions did not need apply in their new homes in the new world of America. Now, these immigrants kept referring to themselves as English, as well as keeping in touch with their family and friends in England. They were not cut off from English society. In their minds, they had only moved to the periphery of the empire. They're loyal British subjects. So we need to remember that the vast majority of the historical treatises we've read to this point were nothing more than religious or political propaganda works trying to convince a reader of a certain point. And in regards to how the Puritans were giving much of the attention in the immigration from England, one must remember that there were other non-religious immigrants traveling with these Puritans. In fact, the business community of these early colonies where these Puritans reigned had to employ promoters and recruiters to convince persons in England to come to America. People were not clamoring to get here. And migration, I guess you could say, to America was to a large part linked with the various political upheavals back home in England. So there's actually a back and forth when it came to migration and immigration from England to America. I mean, during the 1680s and 90s, the quote-unquote Great Migration, immigration, the number of people returning to England exceeded those coming to America by more than about 19,000 people. So there's just some quiz show notes there for you to give you a foundation of where we're going. So let me tell you where I'm going. I'm trying to go with all this. You've read about the settling of major colonies like Virginia, Massachusetts Bay in Chapter 2. I've mentioned some items on those, not in the text. And now I'll mention issues on them all. But I'm not going to go into detail on all those colonies like I did Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay. What I'm going to emphasize now is how these colonies were put together by England into a system, an empire, a colonial system. A colonial system that lasted for over 100 years, and it worked pretty darn well for 100 years. And then I'll be ready to tell how that system broke down and resulted in what we call the American Revolution, and eventually the development of our own current Constitution. And when I get through that, we'll have a nice block of material for a test, right? Now, like I stated in the first summary, my audio summaries, if you want to call them that, are not strictly chapter summaries. They're rather thematic summaries of events linking your chapters and walking us into the revolution, of course, your first exam. So please don't get upset when these issues cross chapters. If you've read them, this should not be an issue. So let's get started with this old colonial system. Well, by 1640, guys, England had colonies in North America in two places, Virginia and Maryland. The Dutch were in between in a place called New Netherlands. Now, did England plant these colonies with an elaborate plan by the government that said, we're going to create an American empire? Well, absolutely not, right? It wasn't like that at all. One person said that England created these colonies in a fit of absent-mindedness. I think there's something to that. I mean, Virginia was a venture in private enterprise. Massachusetts was a religious experiment in applied theology. They weren't set up by a plan from the English government at all. Now, from 1640 to 1660, there weren't any more colonies created in the New World. Right? You've got that Puritan Revolution going on over there. So no new colonies were created. But then in 1660 beginning, there was that restoration with Charles II. Now, you've already discussed that, and you've read about it. Okay? But once Charles II got invested as the new king and started to look around, he took a look at those colonies and said, you know, we should probably do something with those colonies and make those colonies work for the benefit of England. In other words, I want me a colonial system, an empire. So we can date the beginnings of the old colonial system from 1660. The restoration of Charles II. Now, the creation of this colonial system meant a lot of things, according to Dr. Machen, that I think are very important. Now, first, it created a second wave of colonies being created in the New World. The first wave was before 1640. The second wave was between 1660 and 1690, where there were 6 new colonies created. Now, these were mentioned, I think, in Chapter 2. You don't have to know them for a test. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, North and South Carolina. Who cares? They linked up what was already there and used the Carolinas to protect from the South. What is important you need to remember is that, as your textbook has already told you, every colony is what is known as a proprietary colony. Proprietary. That just means it's owned by somebody or a family, right? Earlier colonies had not been proprietary colonies. Walter Raleigh, anybody? He failed, right? No one person had those resources. But as time went on, one individual could. So like you get places like Pennsylvania, William Penn, right? And there are others. Now, building an empire also, second thing here, right? Building an empire also required applying a certain set of economic ideas to the colonies that would benefit England. I mean, England's not doing this for our health, guys. They want a return on the profit. Now, the theory I'm getting at here is called mercantilism. And your textbook talks about it. Yeah, I liken it to like a cluster of ideas that developed over a period of time, the basic point of which, I think is still relevant today, holds that all nations are in economic competition with one another. And like I said, I think that still applies today in a sense. Now, in this competition, all countries want a favorable balance of trade. Now, let's stop and think about that for a minute. I thought a balance was a balance. how the heck can you have a balance be favorable? Well, basically, what you have here is when your country has a favorable balance of trade well, you're selling more than you're buying, right? You're exporting more than you're importing. Now, in order to attain this balance, other nations give you things like gold and money, right? And the more gold and silver and money your country has, the stronger you are. That's a favorable balance of trade, according to your nation. That's what you want. You want other countries sending you precious metals to settle up an unfavorable balance of trade in your favor. Because back then they had this concept that if England's got more gold, France has less. Now, where do the colonies fit in? Well, people in England really love things like tobacco, right? And England didn't produce tobacco, therefore she's going to have to import it from the colonies. Now, who else has colonies in the Americas? Well, the Spanish do. Now, what does England need in the colonies that will ensure that a lot of money will not leave England and go to another country? Well, what she's going to do here is set up these colonies so that they are utilized to produce for the mother country what she cannot produce for herself. Sugar, timber, etc., right? Anything that England can't or does not have a lot of, she's going to get those colonies to send it to her so she doesn't have to buy it from other nations. Money stays in-house. And also the colonies were there to be markets for what England produced, because those are English colonists. They don't want those colonies buying dresses from France. No, buy your clothes from England. Money stays in-house. That's the theory of mercantilism. Now, when you set up colonies with this idea in mind, do you think you can just sit back and think that the colonies will do the right thing economically? Well, of course not. People are going to do what makes them the most. They will pursue their own interest from the beginning to the end. Therefore, mercantilism meant trade regulations when it came to the colonies. Mercantilism meant that England was now going to have to tell the colonies how they had to behave. You got to regulate them. So what happens, guys, and your textbook talks about it in chapter 3, between 1660 and 1663, England's going to pass a variety of regulatory acts to enforce mercantilism. And they're always called the Navigation Acts. So take a look at your textbook and be familiar with those Navigation Acts. They're very important, okay? Very important. Now, there's going to be a lot of problems of enforcing these Navigation Acts, as you'll see, because some colonies fit into this system of mercantilism better than others. I mean, you don't have to know this, but for example, the southern colonies were predominantly agriculture, and they produced a lot of things England wanted. So they fit into the colony quite well. But the New England colonies up north, well, they didn't have a lot of agriculture. So they got into fishing, shipbuilding, and once they got into shipbuilding, they began using those ships to haul their products. Commerce was very active in New England. So slowly and surely, the New England colonies began to develop manufacturing, right? I mean, New England was the first to develop manufacturing in America. The point is that due to its position geographically, New England began to develop an economy that was very much like England's. They were in competition with England, right? Their interest did not lay so much in working within this old colonial system. And as you already know from reading the text, this is where all the problems began to emerge. Those New England colonies. Now, being good Englishmen, because they began evading the law from day one. I mean, you could make money if you obeyed the rules, but if you don't obey the rules, you make more money. And from the very beginning, the colonists broke the rules. And it was very hard to enforce. I mean, that's a big, long coastline out there, the eastern seaboard. It's very hard to enforce the lawbreakers. But gradually word began to filter down to the English, to Parliament, that the colonies were not obeying all those rules. And it didn't take them long to figure it out. And in 1673, they decided to do something. They said that custom duties, don't call them taxes, custom duties on those enumerated goods you read about in your textbook were to be collected when they were loaded in America. That meant for the first time, English officials, custom collectors, were sent to America in 1673 to try to enforce some of these Navigation Acts, okay? And once they get here, they see just how much the Americans were disobeying law. And they, of course, report that back to England, and England tries to crack down even harder, creates tensions. I mean, it was this conflict between the colonies and England that was key in leading the Crown to strip the Massachusetts Bay of its charter in '84. Okay? And anyway, due to all the problems Parliament was seeing in the New World, in America, with her colonies, led Parliament to take drastic action in 1686. She decided that what they needed to do to get control of violations of the Navigation Acts was to create something called the Dominion of New England. And again, it's in your textbook, but basically what the textbook's going to try to explain to you is that, the Dominion of New England is basically what we would call today a super colony. They rolled all the problem colonies north of Pennsylvania and Delaware into one colony. So they took 6 colonies and made one out of it, right? That was to have just one governor, so all the governors from those other colonies out of work. And as far as all those general assemblies, those burgesses, those governing bodies, those places where the colonists had voices in all those colonies, they were disbanded. They have no voice. Okay? Now, I know your textbook covers a lot of this. I'm going to let it handle it as far as how the colonists got out of this issue. They were very lucky. So you can read about the Glorious Revolution and how that saved the colonists from the Dominion. Now, just because the idea of the Dominion of New England was dropped does not necessarily mean that the idea of colonialism and mercantilism was dropped. Instead, you're going to read in the textbook that the English government's going to finally get around to the problem of its colonies. They're going to reorganize, and in 1696 try to do some things to make sure those navigation acts were followed. So, for example, guys, I'm not going to hold you responsible for this, but in 1696, they passed a new series of navigation acts, put something in it called the writs of assistance. These are like general search warrants. They allowed custom collectors to go into any place and search if they thought someone was trying to avoid the Navigation Act requirements. Now, in our Bill of Rights, there's a restriction on unreasonable search and seizures, right? Yeah, see right here, colonials got so sick of those general search warrants that this became part and parcel of our country today. It lingered, I promise you. Now, about 1696, roughly speaking, all the way up to 1763, right? The British didn't essentially change the mercantilistic system of trade regulations. They really didn't. And that's a long time. And I'm going to start using this date of 1763 as a magical date. I hope you figure out why. There were some additions to the system, and they matter, I guess, because they're additions, but they never changed the overall structure or makeup. So, for example, there were some additions, like they tried to prevent the colonists from getting into manufacturing. So they passed some laws to try to restrict them of that. They tried to keep colonists from buying foreign goods. So they'll pass some laws against that. That's it. Nothing major, nothing super harsh. And generally speaking, the colonists went along with these items for basically 2 simple reasons. They didn't fuss over it or get upset because they needed the protection of the British Navy. Remember, they've got the French to the north and the Spanish to the south, and they do not have their own navy. They need protection. And another reason, remember, anything that really bothered them, they just disobey it anyway. Bribery, smuggling, you name it. They just found ways to get around these laws. So they just kind of went along with it. Okay? And the British knew about this. They knew about bribes. They knew about the smuggling. But the English followed a policy called salutary neglect. Now, what's that? Well, if something's salutary, it's helpful, it's beneficial, and obviously you know what neglect is. But basically the British said, look, we know these colonists are disobeying some of our rules, but in general things are going well. So we'll just leave it alone. Let's don't rock the boat, right? We've got a saying here in Texas that's very similar. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If it's working, don't mess with it. Leave it alone. So what comes as a result of that? Let me try to summarize this old colonial system for you. So what were the results? So by 1763, that magical date, almost 100 years, 1763, you got a situation where England, although not every rule was obeyed, benefited from having these colonies added to her economy. By 1763, England was the world's greatest power, economically and militarily, unchallenged. And she knew the colonies helped her get there. The colonies, on the other hand, were bothered by the Navigation Acts. The restrictions cost them money at times, but they had the protection of the British Navy. They grew, they prospered. The number of the colonies in 1660s were a little bit more than 50,000. By the 1760s, they're close to 2 million. By the 1760s, the colonists had a strong enough agricultural economy that they were developing a commercial economy, and they were becoming strong enough to fight a war soon against the world's greatest power and win. And they knew they got there with their connection with the British Empire. So generally speaking, the way this thing worked out was you had a poorly defined, poorly enforced system that was working to the benefit of both sides. It was a working economic relationship with benefits for both sides. Now, if you look at it that way, you find what I call low-key conflict between the colonies and the mother country. That is to say, the colonies were constantly trying to get more control over their own affairs, constantly pushing for more control over their governments, those colonial assemblies, trying to get more things that worked in their self-interest, more self-rule. But hey, that's what government's all about, right? Or I guess I'm sorry, I forgot that the United States government works perfectly and it's beholden to its citizens. It works for the interest for everybody. And of course, we never have conflict in the United States government. Everybody in the U.S. government is happy. Every citizen in the United States is okay with the way our government's been run, right? I mean, this is just how it is, guys. In most places in the world, there is always some type of conflict between the government and its people. People are going to want one thing, and some people are going to want something else. That's just how it is. And back then, the colonies wanted more control. Well, guess what England wanted? Keep them under control. Enforce trade regulations. Make them work towards the interest of the mother country. But these are low-key conflicts, not large, blown out of proportion events. The colonists are not going around screaming that they're being oppressed and they want independence. Nothing can be farther from the truth. They are loyal citizens, just like us. It's just the type of thing that goes on in government all the time. Okay? Now getting back to our subject. Almost done. The colonies recognized that Great Britain had the authority to do certain things when it came to governance. So certain things, such as England's ability to decide war and peace, were never questioned. Nor were England's ability to institute trade regulations. They, the colonies, never said England could not pass these trade regulations. They just might not obey them, right? But they did recognize that the government had the perfect right to do certain things. However, they claimed certain rights that they insisted were theirs. For example, the colonists insisted they had the right and the authority to tax themselves. This is key, guys. You've got to remember this. Up to 1763, that magic date again, the English government never taxed the colonies directly. Instead, the local assemblies in those colonies taxed themselves. And the colonists said that was their right. It's critical. Understand this now. So important for later. So 1763, the colonies are in pretty good shape, running their own affairs. So we've got up to 1763, once again. The old colonial system is a working relationship, both economically and politically, to the reasonable advantage of both sides. It's not perfectly defined, but it's working nonetheless. But, and this is very important, while they were going along, getting along, the colonies on the one hand and England on the other, they had really different ideas as to exactly where the power and the rights were and where they came from. I hope you see that. They were not defining things, they were just going along, so long as everything flowed smoothly. It was a very ill-defined relationship. So they got to thinking like this, the colonists did. The colonies by 1763 began basing their rights off what they considered to be precedents. They started saying things like, we have a right to a colonial assembly. We have a right to be the only ones who can tax us. It's our rights. Our assemblies are just as powerful as parliaments. Well, of course they would say that. It's to their advantage to say that. But if the English, if you push them, if you were to push the English and ask them, you know what they would say. They'd say, you colonists don't have any rights. We've just been nice. We've just been letting you do these things. We can tax you. We've just not been doing it. And they're right. They'd been just going along, getting along for over 100 years, and in the process, the colonists had forgotten just where the power was and exactly who had the authority to do what. So suppose something happened that forced the two to actually sit down and decide, or better yet, define their relationship as it related to where the authority lay and who had the power. What might happen to this working relationship? Well, like I said, break up. And that's exactly what began to happen. Because in 1763, my friends, something happened.